Hello and welcome to Chapter 10. We're nearing the end of our journey together. So this chapter goes through the qualitative research designs. I'm not going to go over the specific designs, mostly because I don't know that I would add much on to Macmillan's words, and I think it's fairly easy to pick those out. But I do want to add some things here to the general methodology and how it's different than quantitative. So one difference is that traditionally quantitative research was there was this belief that under everything, if we could truly see, there was one specific truth, and maybe we won't quite get at it, or maybe we will never even know if we're close, but there is that one specific truth out there. Whereas qualitative research is generally founded on the principle that there may be multiple realities, multiple stories, perspectives. And again, when I make any differences between these two, they're very broad, very general. There's always exceptions to this. Okay, another thing is context. So we talked about internal validity and external validity. The qualitative research would usually want to function in a natural context. And that's going to increase the external validity. If we do some kind of very isolated study in a laboratory classroom, it may not be anything like the typical classroom where kids are running around, a guy is poking a girl because he likes her and she's getting annoyed, and 5 other kids are watching them, and no one's really paying attention to the what's being taught in the front of the classroom. That's the reality. That's what a qualitative researcher would want to see. They would want to see teaching as it really is, not as it could be isolated in a class, isolated in a laboratory. And then researcher bias. So quantitative research is going to say, because there's this objective truth, we want to separate anything out. We don't want to say Daniel Showalter's approach to this particular truth or someone else's approach to this particular truth. We just want to know the truth, and it shouldn't matter which researcher is telling us. Qualitative, we're often going to take in the background of the researcher, because these biases are present, and we want to know what are the biases. So in qualitative research, a good, credible qualitative research piece will set forth their biases very honestly. They'll say, I'm a white, middle-aged male. If I'm doing some kind of study on race, for example, I would want to make sure the reader understood what perspective I was coming from, because that will affect my results. Okay. So some characteristics, as I said, qualitative is typically going to be in a natural setting. You're going to study through observation or interviewing. You may be pulled out of the natural setting a little bit, but you're still aiming at getting what's typically going on. You don't want to change it, versus in a quantitative situation where maybe we would give some drug and we want to see if this drug actually changes the person to have a difference on them. Qualitative, not always, but typically is going to be more observational and trying to capture that natural setting. Okay, the data collection, as I mentioned, observations, interviews. Another one is document analysis. And oftentimes you'll want a combination of these three to really get a sense of what's going on. Rich narrative means very descriptive. We want to use, when you read some kind of field notes, you should be able to picture exactly what was going on. The girl seemed annoyed at the boy behind her because he was poking her with a pencil. You should be able to picture this in your head. You don't want to just say some facts that are disconnected and doesn't allow you or the eventual reader to understand what was going on. And this how and why is important too, because quantitative, we're often looking at what is the effect or how much is the effect. But when we want to get into some of those deeper, piercing questions, qualitative research is often very good at pulling up the roots of why something is going on. Inductive often gets associated with qualitative, building theories, whereas deductive then quantitative will test it. But again, that can intermix. Emerging research design. So quantitative, by the time you actually collect the data, when you write your lit review, your methodology, nothing should change. You're kind of locking it in place, final answer, and then you're going to see what the data says. Qualitative is very different. In the first portions of your research paper, you'll state what you're interested in, or some kind of problem, maybe not even a problem, maybe it's a phenomenon that you're interested in, or just looking at some case, but you have some general topic that you're going to collect data on, and as you collect the data, your research question may very well change. And that's very common in qualitative research. Let's see, data collection. So again, this can be very tricky in qualitative because there's relationships involved, there's egos involved, there's cultures involved. There's a lot more concern for social well-being or social safety because of confidentiality issues. So a lot of this needs to be considered before the research is conducted. And this is one thing, even in qualitative, that does need to be set up early so that it can go through the institutional review board for approval before you do any kind of study on human subjects. And that's why it takes a long time. It's dangerous too. So I'm not sure if some of you have to do a thesis or a dissertation. The danger of qualitative research is you could think that you have this entire sample set up and ready for data collection, and then when you go, suddenly the school that you were going to collect at has a new principal who's not willing to let any data collection go on, and now you're back to square one. So data collection can always be a bit tricky. It can be a lot more interesting than quantitative, but it can also run into some snags that are pretty fatal to research projects. That's happened to me at least one occasion. Okay, selecting participants. Remember, in a quantitative, we typically want a random sample. Now, there may be situations where we can't get it, so there's modified versions of the random sample, because that then allows us to generalize our results. That's not the case in qualitative. We're going to select our participants based on where we think the real data is. So if we're looking for, say, cases of abuse, say we're looking at abuse in students, whereas a quantitative study may just take a random sample and see how much abuse is present in among the school system. A qualitative would probably try to look specifically for some kids who have been abused, either verbally, physically, emotionally, whatever, because they're going to have a lot of data on that topic. And I hesitate saying that they're the data sources, because whenever you're conducting research, you want to make sure that you're seeing your participants as humans, not just data sources. And that's where research has run into a lot of snags, especially early to mid last century. So once you get these information-rich participants. You may want to do extremes. So let's say we're, I don't know, looking at the effect of height on socialization. We might want some very, very tall people and some very, very short people, because this allows us to see the contrast a lot more. We can attribute the differences more to the variable that we're taking extreme cases on more. Snowball, this is a sampling method I've used before on a national study where it's not so clear where exactly your best sources of information are. So I was looking at place-based education, I was looking at schools, rural schools that incorporate the local community and environment into their math teaching. And there's not, I mean, there may be some websites on place-based math education, but not with a comprehensive list of what schools are doing. So we talked to several experts in the field, and we asked them, do you know of any schools? And do you know of any other people who might know? And they told us other people, and who told us other people. And eventually we had this list of 60, which we checked out one by one and chose 7 of those 60 to conduct interviews and field studies at. Okay, I've mentioned these already, really. So these are just different types of purposeful sampling. So this is another, you could say, disadvantage of qualitative information. My very first foray into research was a summer research project where I was working for a couple of researchers, and they had already done all the interviewing, observations, and it was up to me to just kind of sort it out. And so I thought, oh, this shouldn't be too bad. All the data is already collected. So I get a stack of 1,500 pages of interviews and observations, and have to go through all of them and do what's called coding. So I'm separating it out into some kind of organized fashion, maybe all the quotes that deal with frustration, and all the quotes that deal with tension between relationships, all the quotes that deal with a vision for the future. But there's so many ambiguous cases, and after you go through page and page and page, your mind starts to get fuzzy. So keep this in mind. If you are going to do observations and interviews, you're going to come to a point where you're going to have to go through that data and find all the themes. So, of course, to manage a huge task like that, you would need to organize it in some way. Many different ways of coding and categorizing the data. Oftentimes you'll do major codes and then go back through and do some kind of subcoding. And you'll probably have to go through the data a couple times because it's very easy to miss when you're trying to, we have 30 different codes and you're reading these quotes. It's so hard to keep all 30 of those in mind and try to understand what's going on there. So one of the reasons that qualitative research didn't exist in the recognized research field for so long was because of this issue of credibility. So the claim could be that qualitative researchers can just say whatever they want, that can be opinionated, and that's why there's these specific steps of credibility. So making sure that you're engaged with your sample for long enough to see the different things that could happen. Checking with people who were actually in your sample to see if you're telling their story correctly. Triangulation, looking at the data from different perspectives. Here's where observations, interviews, and document analysis can come into play, different ways of looking at it. Negative case analysis. If we're looking at abuse, we may want to look at some cases that aren't abuse so that we can see that contrast. Peer briefing, external audit, people from within our field and without our field reading the work, reflecting on the research, and thick descriptions so that it can be transferred. So we want to make sure that our findings can be transferred. They can't generalize like quantitative can, but certainly there's similarities that can be applied. And